is beginning our 16th series of the Tipperary People and Places lecture series. We'd like to welcome Frances Devine, who has travelled from Howth to be with us tonight. Frances is a former tutor in SIPTU College, and he has written Organising History, a Centenary of SIPTU, 1909 to 2009. He has lectured widely on the history of trade unions in Ireland, and tonight we welcome him to Thurles when he is going to speak to us on the trade unions in Tipperary. So, Frances, very welcome.
Who fears to wear the blood-red badge upon his manly chest? What scab obeys the vile command of Murphy and the rest? He's all a slave and half a knave, who slights his union thus. But true men, like you men, will show the badge with us. The last time I met Joe Lewis, he asked me to sing that to him, so I decided I would start tonight with that. And my thanks, before I do anything else, to Mary Darmody from Tipperary Studies, to Dennis Nenagh, and most of what I'm going to say tonight, Dennis kindly included in the last edition of the journal, so you can follow it up directly or come into the library. And I've had great assistance, as I always did, for Margaret Harty Young, the power behind the throne, and Nenagh for many years for the Union. I'm dedicating the talk, as I always do dedicate talks, to Frank and Joe Lewis, more of whom as we go along, and it's terrific to have members of their family with us. Martin Kennedy, I put Nenagh, he was actually Thurles, but he was Nenagh branch, an ambulance driver. Paddy Cummins of Tiptown, more of whom again and on. Jim Hoch, who was from Thurles, I think a part-time fireman. Tim Looney, who was our branch secretary for many years in Care. My first engagement as a tutor with SIPTU, believe it or not, was in Care for Tim Looney. And Paddy Quigley, who had the unique distinction of being a part-time branch secretary in a full-time branch because he was a psychiatric nurse in Clonmel. So many happy memories for me over the years in Tipperary. Here are the Lewis brothers. The photograph on the left is Frank making Castlebrand pots, and Joe on the right, much later on, when he was a full-time official. You can see he's wearing his badge on his lapel there. And in Nenagh itself, the next time you're in Nenagh and you're in the square, Banva Square, is it, Margaret? You'll see a number of plaques on the wall of the office, but this one is really quite unique in that the two Lewis brothers were quite unique, as they gave 51 years service as full-time officials, or officials, should I say, of the Union, from 1952 in Frank's case, and in Joe all the way through to 1993. It was erected in 2003. This is Frank in fairly typical pose. Unfortunately, I just noticed now we've actually cut him off the photograph. Jim Hoch has gotten away, but Frank is addressing a PRYE rally in the town, and you'll probably recognise a few faces, and this is our friend Jim from here in the town. This was my first ever time in Nenagh. That's me on the back row, the very hairy one on the back row next to Frank, who's smiling away. This woman needs to be mentioned, Margaret Cooney from Nenagh, who made history. She was the first Tipperary woman elected to any national office in the Union. She became a member of the Women's Advisory Committee. Martin Kennedy is on the extreme left, Jim Hoch next to him. This is Teddy Morgan and Billy Fitzpatrick, who were the leading lights, not so much in the Union as far as I was concerned, but when it came to the singing afterwards. And Matty O'Neill at the back with the glasses had recently lost his wife. Before she died, she had a lifelong ambition to go to Heidelberg because she fell in love with the student prince. So Billy and Teddy more or less sang the libretto from the student prince for them, and Teddy was forever known as Nelson Teddy. Okay. Now, before the Transferred Union, which is really what I'm here to talk about, there was quite a history of trade unionism in Tipperary. I'm not going to go through all of these organisations, but you can see they're scattered across the county. They're primarily unions catering for agricultural labourers or people working what we would now call local authorities. They date from about the 1890s, Some of them have strong connections with the United Irish League. There were whole labour leagues that were founded. Others were drawn out of the land league struggles from the late 1870s and 80s. A lot of these places, if you just look at the first names, you'll see repeating themselves as we go through. In 1900, the labour movement, if we can call it a labour movement on this island, was weak, largely confined to the east coast. They were mostly members of British-based unions, particularly for craft unions, and this sometimes has been referred to as the mental colonisation of the Irish movement. And the failure of something called new unionism, which started in the 1890s, which took trade unionism down to the unskilled. It never really took off in Ireland, although there were, as we've seen, some unions. A lot of the members were organised very locally, in local agricultural related unions, and as a consequence didn't really mesh into a national movement as such. Politically, workers were either unionist or home rule and voted and so on, according to their lights, and there was very little socialist expression. So the movement was craft, cautious, conservative with a small c, dominated by the amalgamators, that is to say the British-based unions, and therefore, as I said, can we really talk of an Irish movement? And I would argue we're not really quite there yet, but it happened after 1907. Jim Larkin arrives in Belfast, a Liverpool-born man of Irish extraction from County Armagh, ironically as a delegate to the British Labour Party conference, the only time the British Labour Party has ever held its conference in Ireland. And he discovered when there how poorly organised and poorly paid and exploited the dockers were, and he organised them into the National Union of Dock Labourers, the NUDL, and in 1907 we had a huge strike involving Catholic and Protestant dockers. This was Jim in 1907, and this was a postcard that was produced to raise funds for the strike. And in City Hall in Belfast, if you're ever in Belfast, and if you don't want to go to Belfast, you can look it up online. You can have a virtual tour of the stained glass windows in City Hall. And this was by John McLaughlin, the Derry stained glass artist. You could see, I'm not sure I'm going to work the point out for you. You could see the Jim Larkin at the top, arms akimbo. You could see a custom house steps where he used to talk, and it says not as Catholic or Protestant unionist or nationalist, but as workers together. He also put into the stained glass, if you see it here, you can actually see, picking the glass out, an image of Larkin, and he referred to this as the spirit of Larkinism. And Larkinism became a phrase synonymous with the type of trade union that Larkin founded. It led to his expulsion from the Dockers Union, and he helped to create, in December 1908, the Irish Transport and General Workers Union. Formed by dockers, as you can see, all along the east coast around to Cork, ordinary, poorly educated men, but who had, and there were very few women incidentally at the beginning, they had an immediate sense that their purpose was historic. In 1911, for example, when the Irish Worker was first produced, they used phrases like never in our union's history. They're only 2 years old, but they talk about never in our union's history. This is from the famous 1913 lockout tapestry. If you ever want that in Tipperary, I'm sure it can be arranged. Just contact the union, and the tapestry, which was extended for 1916, can be brought down. And this is Larkin, as O'Casey describes, in a tenement in Townsend Street with a candle in a bottle found in the union. Now, the Transport Union came as a mighty wave, transforming what was a supine labour movement, informed by these four perspectives. They weren't original, but they were originally applied collectively and forcefully. An Irish Union for Irish workers, not for any specifically nationalist reason, but because if you belonged to a union with headquarters in London or Glasgow, you were obviously always going to be late on the agenda, plus which Irish conditions were different. It was a militant union, each for all and all for each. If you were a craftsman, say a carpenter, and there was a strike here in Curlis, well, the employer isn't going to find it easy to get other carpenters. But if you are an agricultural labourer or somebody carting supplies, then it's pretty easy to get other equally strong men to come from somewhere else. So the idea was if one was out, everybody was out. The notion of one big union, get everybody into one big union. There was a socialist perspective, and this developed, as we'll see, up until the Rising, the notion of fighting for a workers' republic. It's in the first objectives of the Transport Union, the notion that the Irish working class would control its own destiny and indeed the wealth that it produced. And they were internationalists. You find in the Transport Union papers from 1911 references to struggles literally across the globe, and they were very conscious of the fact that they were part of an international labour movement. One of the first points we're going to make tonight in the early days of the 21st century is that whereas global capitalism and globalisation are phrases we're used to, the globalisation of the working class remains to be achieved, and we're exploited across the globe as a consequence. The big thing, which was particularly the case in 1913, as described by contemporary people, was that what the Transport Union and Larkinism brought was hope and belief that a system that seemed to be impregnable and permanent could actually be changed. In 1913, for example, as soon as I walk in this room, you'd all know what class I belong to. And class and status were to be given. Well, not after 1913. The union began to challenge that. This headed paper is one of my favourite icons from the union. By the way, it's the strike notice for the tramway workers signed by Larkin on the 26th of August 1913 that led to the lockout. You'll notice it's a monoplane. Now in 1913 there was no Aer Lingus or Dublin Airport. In fact, there weren't really aeroplanes. And if we were talking here and an aeroplane flew over in 1913, this room would empty out and you'd be getting to the nearest window to see what it was. Does anybody know who's flying the plane? It's Blériot, and it was the first man to fly across the channel. So most people, when they saw that, it was a familiar image. But what it indicates, and you can see there, for progress each, for all, over each, this was the union telling the employer, and it must have been a bombshell coming across the table, this is the union of the future. Incidentally, in real life, that aeroplane is a bright emerald green. So let's look at membership very briefly. It starts in 1909, and it rises to the time of the lockout to 30,000, which, as you can see, is about a third of the entire organised working class in the country. So it's a very significant player within 4 years of its creation. It declines after that, for reasons we'll see in a moment, until at the point of the rising, membership is down to 5,000, and it's now a fraction of the entire movement. This is the Liberty Hall. It's on the same spot as the current Liberty Hall. It was opened in 1912. It used to be the Northumberland Hotel. It already had quite a tradition of radical republicanism and nationalism, with various bodies like Young Irelanders and so on meeting there. But this hall becomes quite central to the next stage of the story. So what about the lockout? It's not my function here to talk about the lockout, and I'm sure many of you know much about the lockout, but was it win, lost or drawn? It started, as we've seen, in August, September, lasted all the way through to the end of January, and in some cases a little bit later on. Most workers had to try to get back on terms they could negotiate, so you could argue it was lost. On the other hand, the cornerstone of contemporary Irish trade unionism is the 1913 lockout. We drew a victory from the jaws of defeat. Employers, in other words, couldn't enforce the victory, and the Transport Union survives. This is the famous drape that was done around Liberty Hall of the tapestry that I mentioned. The tapestry, as I've said, is available to come to locations down the country. This was a monument again in Nenagh, which was erected in 2013 on the centenary by Jack O'Connor. And again, I think it's the only monument outside of Dublin to 1913 that was put up. Now you know why the song makes sense, Who Fears to Wear the Red Hand Badge. This was the badge of 1913. They had decided to issue badges with the 4 provincial emblems 1 year after the other, and this happened to be the badge for 1913. And badge obviously is a badge of recognition. The strike was about, or the lockout was about non-recognition, still a major issue for workers, as we're discovering in Amazon's news centre this week. And you'll see that in 1915, it was the 3 Crowns of Munster. They also had similar badges for Connacht and Leinster until in 1918, as a tribute to the women, children and men of 1913, the union decided to keep the red hand as the central feature, and that is still the case to today. The Rising comes along, and this is Liberty Hall just after the Rising. It became effectively unusable. It was shelled by the Helga during the Rising. There was only one person left in the building, Peter Ennis. Wonderful descriptions of him charging down Eden Quay being fired at from across the river. And it reminds me of the last scene in Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid as he zigzagged up the quay. And the other amazing thing about certain like revolutions, there's a crowd watching. There's a revolution taking place, and there's a crowd watching Peter Ennis scooter up the quay. The rising, of course, was important not because the Transfer Union officially participated in the rising. There's no minute saying this is what we're going to do. But the entire weaponry used in 16, or effectively the entire weaponry, was held in Liberty Hall. The volunteers left from Liberty Hall to go to the various locations in Dublin, and of course the officer commanding was the then acting General Secretary of the ITGWU, Jim Larkin, leader of Commandant of the Irish Sitting Army. 1918 is the first year the Union issues an annual report, and it categorically says, Easter week saved the Union. It cancelled out the reaction from 1913 and removed bitter prejudices which had blocked its progress. It linked up the labour movement with the age-long aspirations of the Irish people for emancipation from political and social thraldom, and formed a natural moratorium on the cover of which it was able to make a fresh start on better terms with increased membership. And that's exactly what happened. This is Liberty Hall a year after Connolly was murdered, with the famous drape, James Connolly murdered May 12, 1916, erected by, among other people, Rosie Hackett, who now has a bridge named after her, across the Liffey, and other members of the Women Workers' Union who had made the banner themselves. So let's look what happened to membership. In 1917, membership was about 15,000 and still effectively confined to those East Coast former Dockers branches. But by 1920, it's 120,000. Some people say, or some records say 130,000. And it had expanded spatially to virtually every county in Ireland, and also to every sort of trade and type of profession and employment across the country. And that, as you could see, was a remarkable burst. That's when Tipperary comes into the picture. It declines after that. Larkin had gone to America in 1914 after the lockout, and he doesn't come back until 1923. There's then a very bitter internecine conflict in the union. Larkin is expelled. He sets up the Workers' Union, which immediately removes about 15,000 members, plus which the Free State is now sinking in, as is the rest of the world, into what we now know as the Great Depression. So what about the branches in Tipperary? You'll notice a number on the left-hand side. So for Ahallow, for example, 510. What that means is that was the 510th branch registered with head office. So you can have some idea as to when these branches occurred. All these names and details are in the journal, but I've never given a lecture like this with similar slides where somebody in the audience doesn't say, "Jay, there's my granny, or there's my granddad," or whatever. So you've got really good information from a local history point of view as to where the branches were and who the guys were. So we'll go through some of these, not in a huge rush, but just to give you an idea. Burton Court I find interesting because, of course, Kit Conway, was it? Was one of the International Brigade figures, and he would have been a member of the branch in Burton Court. Kerr, as I mentioned earlier on, Paddy Loningham was one of the few branch secretaries who were elected, by the way, every year by the members, who was elected throughout this period, which tells you something about that man's character. This is the annual conference of the Union in 19, which puts it into perspective. Margaret will tell you that our annual conference now is 4 or 5 days with hundreds of delegates. Well, this was the entire delegation, and somewhere in there were a couple of Tipperary people. But the person I want just to pick out is William O'Brien, who was General Treasurer and then General Secretary of the Union, who you'll see later on was at one stage, he was a Cork man originally, but was at one stage a Labour TD for Tipperary. This incident is Cathal O'Shannon. Some of you remember his son, young Cathal O'Shannon, used to be an RTE. Cathal worked for the Union. Again, we're going back to the branches there, just again not going into any massive detail. Cashel through to Clonmel, and again you've got Michael Lennon was a very long-serving official in Clonmel. This was the calendar that they used, the wall calendar that they published in 1923, and you can see it bears Connolly. Connolly is now sort of the leading figure in people's recollection of the Union. And you'll notice the use of the Irish script. The union was quite keen in the early stages to use Irish when it could in its correspondence and so on. And again, just finishing off with these branches. Nenagh will just focus on for a minute. I should point out at this stage that Ger Lewis has made quite a unique contribution to Irish labour history, Irish social history. He's the only person to have written an extensive history of a branch of a union, namely the Transport Union in Nenagh. Terrific book. Took him many years and many painful journeys through archives and up and down to Dublin, but it's a terrific read, loosening the chains. And most of the detail on these individuals I would have got from Ger. Some of the people, like Maurice O'Regan, weren't from the locality. He was a full-time official. He came from North Cork. But the other people, like William Gleeson, Paddy O'Brien and Patrick Murphy, were local men. And here we see them. Bill Gleeson on the left, Paddy Brett in the middle, and Paddy O'Brien. All again photographs from Ger's book, all Nenagh men. And then we, coming to the last of the slides, the one to pick out here is Tipperary, and the reason we're picking out Tipperary is because the name Miss Kathleen Cleary is extremely rare. She was the only, to my knowledge, woman elected as a branch secretary out of 550 odd branches of the union at that time. So a remarkable achievement, and she was elected by members. In other words, the glass ceiling wasn't just, like we're having somebody placed to have a token woman. She was there because the members in Tipperary town voted her in, and we'll see a little bit more about that later on. This P.J. O'Brien fellow, who was from Tip Town, goes on to become a significant figure in the union in the 40s and 50s and was a full-time official in Cork City. Here we have the Tipperary Town Branch Committee, and this would have given to me by Paddy Cummins, the late Paddy Cummins, who in turn was given it, I'm sure, by Brian O'Donnell. And you can see here we've got various individuals named, including Jack Breen, the branch secretary, and Paddy O'Doherty. And the wee boy, we even know who he is, that's wee Neddy Breen. So Tipperary branches that we know existed but are not recorded in the annual report. And that's probably because when you think of how rapidly the union expanded, I've always thought of head office as being like a surfer. You're on top of this wave, that, like it was spontaneous organisation. They weren't going out to look for members. Members just flooded in. So some of these branches sort of escaped notice of head office and or were quickly absorbed by local bigger branches. So all of those places also had branch committees. In the silver mines case, I'm not sure who they were. That would be one that would have intrigued Frank, because when I first met Frank, his big battles were with mining companies and transnational companies and so on. And Frank used to sit on international union committees for mine workers, so quite a significant figure. So the first branches in Tipperary, Roscrea in 28 was number 28, and that was actually formed just after the war. Nenagh was an early one, and then the others are relatively late, but the numbers are slightly misleading because whole numbers came in at the same time. So you just your number was what head office sort of gave you. And here we see Roscrea is listed in 1918, the only Tipperary branch on the headed paper. They quickly dropped the branches from the headed paper because there was too many of them. This again is the original Liberty Hall, and again you can see each roll and over each. What's interesting about this, it's 1918, is Jim Larkin is still the General Secretary, despite the fact he hasn't been in the country for 4 years, and is about to be imprisoned in Sing Sing prison in New York and won't return until 1923. Okay, some of the great local heroes that local historians here might investigate were Jimmy Cook in Ardfinnan, who was branch secretary for 8 years. McLennan, we pointed out in Clonmel, John or Sean Power in Latin, John Sheehan in Listuff, and Patrick Perkins here in the town. Now, Perkins to me wouldn't be that common a name, so I don't know if there's still Perkins around in Turles, but it'd be interesting to find out any that related to Patrick. Kathleen Cleary, we've mentioned already, as being quite unique in that she was the only woman branch secretary. Most of these branches were what we in the union call part-time. That is to say, they were not paid by the union. They were elected by the members on an annual basis, and they would have had their expenses covered for things like postage and mileage and stuff like that, but they weren't full-time officers. But these branches did have full-time officers, at least for periods of time. Michael Banks and Carrick Shaw, more later on about him. Lennon, as we've seen, served for a long time, part of which he was full-time. Gleeson in the early days in Nenagh. Now there was a split in Nenagh in 1923 or 1924 with the Workers' Union, which Ger has covered at great length. And then in Tiptown, the two officials were Paddy Hart and P.J. O'Brien. This is P.J. O'Brien, a very dapper man. I never knew the man, he was gone before I joined the union. This is him in 1938 and later on in 59. He was famous for his bow ties, apparently. This is the glove factory in Tipperary, images I'm sure you're familiar with. And the reason I put this up is because this is the census return for Kathleen Cleary. As you can see, and I'll give it to you this way, she lived in Emmett Street in Tipperary. Her father was a widower, a land surveyor, born in Tipperary. But Kathleen and her sister were both love makers, both born in Limerick. And Nora, the younger sister, was born in Kerry, so it suggests the father had obviously moved around. This, which I have in my hand, I think is a fabulous document. It's going to be resting here in Limerick in a few weeks. It's Kathleen's, it's the membership card, as you can see at the top left, for Bridget James of Banshire Road, Tipperary for 1919. You can see how they filled the card in every week. So you had to go to your shop steward or your branch collector, and Kathleen would have countersigned that as the branch secretary. So, fairly responsible job. If you think that people were earning a very small amount of money, and yet suddenly she's got loads of cash from all these people, and she has to account for it, bank it, as Margaret will tell you, do a bank reconciliation, and so on a weekly basis. But Kathleen was the branch secretary, so there's her signature up at the top, which I think is absolutely fabulous. This again is just the glove making in Tipperary. This time the men, and I don't know enough about the glove making, but I suspect as in most employments, these fellows were earning more than the women were, but probably doing less of the intricate work. So what about the branches in Tipperary? On the left-hand column, say 1918, there were 18 branches representing 437 members. That rose to that 1920 peak of 43 branches with 6,282 members, but it declined to 6 in 1928 with 517. There's nothing unusual about this. This was the pattern literally across Ireland, almost without exception, as the fortunes of the union and the working class generally fell after 1924-5. If we look at the percentage of Tipperary members compared to the whole of the union, you could see that Tip was never a massive presence in the union, 6.1% in 1920, and falling to about 2.5, just over 2.5 in 1928. But again, you've got to remember there were branches in all 32 counties, so you know doesn't be quite as bad as it looks. And Tipperary was regarded, not least by O'Brien, who had a soft spot for Tip for obvious reasons, as being a very crucial county for obvious reasons. What you may be noticing is that the southern end of the county, not so much Clonmel, but certainly Carrick and Shaw in that area, are missing, and they disappeared after the 1923 farm labourers disputes, which were defeated badly. And Dennis was saying this to me earlier, the Carrick end tended to identify with Waterford, which is where the biggest defeat took place. And if you look at the Transport Union, SIPTO even today, it's got a national coverage in the Republic, with the exception of a triangle from just outside Waterford City to Youghal, including Dungarvan, up to Carrick. They still are not members of the union, so old habits die hard. This is a rather different way of measuring a union. It's looking to the monies remitted from head office, because the annual reports, which are incidentally are now uploaded, digitised, they're online for consultation. And I'll give Mary Guinan the reference to that when I thank her for tonight. So any of you can just look at these reports themselves on the Irish Labour History Society website. They give you the amounts of money paid to head office and the amounts of money paid from head office. So the amounts of money paid to head office, you can see again, not surprising, 1920 was the largest amount, 4,000. But you see the second figure is the amount of money paid by head office to the branch. Why would Dublin head office pay a country branch? What would they be giving them money for, do you think? Yep, strike pay, dispute pay. There were actually only two benefits, dispute pay and mortality benefit. And in 1919, for example, not particularly evident here, there was a lot of money paid out because of the flu epidemic. But in most cases, when you see a figure like 1923, £7,810, which is considerably more than the money collected from the membership, you know there was a big strike. So by going through these records for the individual branches as a local historian, you can at least pinpoint the year in which a dispute takes place in Killinall or in Claheen or wherever you want to do. In 1923, the union spent an incredible 156% of its entire income on strike pay. If you just think about that, 1.5 times the entire income, you'd almost think that this trust was the treasury, wouldn't you? But 156% of its entire income. Yet it never levied members. It didn't do anything to do that. It just fed on its resources. A lot of those strikes were unsuccessful because the Free State was taking on the workers and trying to break wages, etc. And a lot of the strikes in farming areas collapsed, not least because of what was happening in agriculture. And the big one in Tipperary was in Ballingarry. It lasted throughout the entire year. And I can actually give you the full figures from Ballingarry because they were published recently in an article. What you see here then is throughout the period, Tipperary contributed 15,500 to head office and got 14,000 back by different payments. So, you know, the union, if you want to use crude terms, ran at a surplus in Tipperary. So, you know, Tip was still contributing along. And here we see the Tipperary strike pay as a proportion of national strike pay. And again, 1922-23 are the big figures where Tipperary strikes were significant nationally. These are the sort of lads that were on strike. There were women on strike in farms and dairies, but the majority of people were either farm labourers like this or fellas that worked as scavengers and road workers, some on direct labour schemes through county councils and urban district councils, but these are the sort of lads that were on strike. Now, other major strikes that you can pick out are Carrick-on-Shore in 1922 and Tiptown in 1922 as well. I'm not clear without going to local papers as to what these strikes were. They may well have been, again, related to agriculture. This is the Ballingarry one. And when you think that Ballingarry only had, you know, a couple of hundred members max, that's a huge outlay. And Carrick-on-Shore in 1923. This is one of the letters in the Beggars Bush, the Labour History Society, which is a letter in from the Ballingarry branch secretary in 1921. So there are quite a number of files of branches. So if you were looking to look at the Tipperary branch, it's worth inquiring, does the Labour History Museum archive, Labour History Society archives have Transport Union branch files for that particular branch? And if they do, most of the correspondence. On the back of this is the carbon copy of the letter going out to the branch, so you get both sides of the story. In 1923, the Free State was quite involved in strike breaking on behalf of particularly the larger farmers. So the class nature of the Free State was revealed pretty early on, and this is a typical scene in 1923. Now, in Carrick-on-Shore, you know, this part of this mystery as to why Carrick-on-Shore drops. Michael Banks was the branch secretary until 1923. His family lived in Jones's Lane. He was a dairy labourer, and they were the rest of the family. But after, this is again his census return, just showing you again, you can track people now, you know, pretty easily. But in 1922-3, there were strikes in Cleves and factory occupations. The farmers locally formed a civic guard. There was all sorts of rumours about that the workers were getting Russian gold and Russian arms and all the rest of it, and the workers were badly defeated. And it's pretty clear the union was simply wiped out in Carrick-on-Shore and was never really revived. After 1930, this is sort of general terms of what was happening to the union. These are the branches as represented at annual conference, or in reports in the annual conference. So the membership figures, as you can see for 1940, virtually nobody left in Tipperary. Ardfin in 98, Care 91, and Clonmel Mental Hospital 48. We had begun to organise psychiatric nurses. In 53 it's risen, and you've got branches spread again across the county. All of these would have been part-time branches, so people were elected locally. So Frank Lewis is about to be elected, or has just been elected, as part-time branch secretary for Nenagh. And you know the story that he went before a Nenagh Ormond rugby match with his hoop jersey under his jacket, not expecting his life to change. So he never got capped for Ireland, but he did in the trade union sense of the term. And then in 2000, when SIPTU is 10 years going, these are the branches that we have. There are still a small number of local branches, including Liam Ryan here in Turles, although all of them would have been organised, all of those branches would have been organised either out of Clonmel or Nenagh. Now, the other phenomenon that we must look at very briefly in the 1930s was the revival, not absolutely unique, but pretty unique to Tipperary, of working men's protective and benefit societies. And there you see some of them: Care, Clerihan, Latin, a second Clare one, Knockgraffan, and the most famous of them all, the Tipperary Working Men's Protective and Benefit Society. It was founded in 1911, and it's not quite clear why it was founded. Again, I haven't got to the local papers to find out, but it probably was inspired by the beginnings of the Transport Union, and it joins the Transport Union in 1920. And virtually all of those local bodies we saw before were part of the collapse of unions, small local unions, into the Transport Union in the 1917 to 20 period. There's lots of records of, in those days, local newspapers gave you, verbatim reports of branch committee meetings. So the branch would meet, somebody would propose, we joined the Transport Union, agreed, and that would be it. It would be, just transfer over. It becomes independent again in 1932, and that's probably because of how the Transport Union itself had collapsed. Tipperary was beginning to revive. Brian O'Donnell tells me there were new industries or revived industries in Tipperary town. And then in 1943 it goes back into the Transport Union. Now the reason it did that is because in 1941 the Trade Union Act said that to have a negotiating licence, you can't operate as a union without a negotiating licence. You had to have a minimum number of members and lodge a fairly substantial sum of money with the state before you could get the licence. And many small unions, like the Tipperary Working Men's, couldn't afford to do that and simply went back to the Transport Union. This is the badge, quite unique badge, not just for Tipperary, but a unique badge, I think, in Ireland, for the original Tipperary Working Men's Protective and Benefit Society. Does anybody know who this is? It's Michael O'Callaghan. Michael O'Callaghan was the first, or certainly one of the first, if not the first, branch secretary for the Tipperary Working Men's Protective and Benefit.
He also killed 2 policemen.
Yeah, I was going to say that. And this badge, there is a debate as to whether the badge was produced before or after he killed the 2 policemen in the Glen of Aherlow in 1916. I think I'm right in saying that these 2 were the only fatalities outside of Dublin. He went on the run to the States and they struck this badge, according to Brian, in his honour. It's the only badge that I'm aware of any Irish trade union that bears the portrait of one of their leading figures. So it's quite a unique badge. There are actually 4 of them, labelled 1, 2, 3, 4. And the reason they're labelled 1, 2, 3, 4 is because in those days the badge was technically the property of the union, not the member. So if you were paid up in January, they gave you number 1. And then, in April, they didn't give you number 2 until you cleared off for number 1, and so on. It was known as quarterly control. So that's why that was. This is Michael, born in 1887 in Henry Street. He worked as a clerk in Denny's, a point not insignificant in terms of what happened to him later on, and in the Cleves condensed milk factory. And in 1916 he was actually the manager of Cleves in Latin. And you'll notice there was a Latin Working Men's Protective Society, so whatever. He became secretary in 1911 and he was active in Tipperary Trades Council. He was also active in Cunran Gaelga, the Volunteers, the IRB, associated with Tracy and Breen. And on the 26th of April at Nenagh, he shot dead the 2 RSC men and escaped to New York. When he comes back, he's made a clerk of Tipperary District Court and served as a member of Tipperary UDC. Dennis has a lot more information than I do, but he's certainly a very fascinating figure. He dies in 62 in Waterford, and I'm indebted to Paddy Cummins for giving me the badges. These are membership cards for the Tipperary Working Men's, the branch secretary there being Joseph Cattle, and you can see the different names of the individuals that received the cards, mostly belonging to this man, Ned Martin of Cashel Road. who incidentally was also a member of the Transport Union. So it shows you how this one man's cards, and Paddy Cummins gave me his cards from both, how they went from one union to the other when the particular union was in operation. Going back to the post-1930 period, these are just some of the names again you could pick out from a local history point of view of people that attended conference. Now, to attend a Transport Union conference, particularly from places like Care or Roscrea or part-time branches, you needed to be elected by your members and possibly by members in a locality. So all of these individuals would have been prominent, probably as branch secretaries, certainly as shop stewards in the local areas. And again, I'm not going to go through the names, but you'll see some of them we've already mentioned, like Paddy Cummins in Tiptown. Paddy incidentally worked in Centenary Co-op. Now, there was an association between the Transport Union and the Labour Party. It was in Clonmel in 1912 that the Labour Party was actually formed. Slight misnomer because it wasn't formed as such, but it became part of the Irish Trade Union Congress. And the ITUC and Labour Party, or Irish Labour Party and TUC, were the same body until 1930. And it's really only after 1930 that Labour stands alone as a separate organisation. But Transport Union was always affiliated, and different individuals in TIP were elected. Daniel Morrissey, who became quite a controversial figure from Labour because he goes as an independent and then eventually to Cumann and Ale and Fine Gael. O'Brien we've already seen. This is Daniel Morrissey, who was also a TD from Nenagh, and O'Brien standing in Tipperary, in Clonmel, I should say, in the 20s. And this is O'Brien from his election posters of the time. Here he is coming out one of the polling booths. It shows you how life has changed and so on, but you can see you wouldn't be allowed to stick O'Brien election posters next to a polling booth today. Other TDs were Patrick Tierney, Transport Union member in North Tip, John Ryan, who was a rail clerk, a member of the Transport Salaried Staffs Association, and of course the present incumbent, Alan Kelly. Alan Kelly and Ger arranged for the Irish Labour History Society to deposit a considerable amount of Labour history books in the library in Nenagh. So if any of you are particularly interested in Labour history, the book isn't here in Tip, and I'm sure they're on the index for the holdings. And if not, then I'm sure Alan will sort you out. In South Tip, we have Sean Tracy, who again, quite a controversial figure in the end, as he goes independent, and then Michael Ferris. And here again, we've got some of the pictures, Paddy Tierney on the left, Ryan and Kelly. And here are two more of people, one of whom I haven't mentioned so far, who was Richard Stapleton, who was very briefly a National Labour Party TD, Labour Party TD in the 1940s. He was from Clonmel, he was a bookbinder. Now, before we finish, we must mention, apart from Kathleen Cleary, a couple of women who are not strictly speaking part of this story, but are significant Tipperary women who came to national prominence as trade unionists. The one on the left is Sissy Cahalan, who was from Northcavan, and she becomes a leader of the Shop Workers Union, and is a pretty significant figure in her time, in the 20s, 30s and so on. Did a lot of things, campaigning for things like equal pay, which were just unheard of. But the woman on the right is even more famous. She's Catherine Mahan from Blacker and Carrick, and she becomes, by the way, she seems to have as much connection, as you probably know better than I do, given the address, with the Offaly Labour movement as she does with Tipperary. She was an activist in the Offaly Trades Council and stuff. She was a leader of the Irish National Teachers Organisation, again at a time when women just didn't hold national positions, and she was highly regarded. Niamh Paschale's book, Kindling the Flame, A Recent History of the INTO, you'll find a lot of detail about Catherine Mahan. So again, if any of you have kids or grandkids looking for lead insert or undergraduate products, you want a local one, Catherine Mahan would be ideal. There is a few things written about it, but not as much as there should be. And then just look at this picture for a minute, because there's a couple of people that I owe things to. The top left is a face familiar to the cowboy section of any library in Tipperary, so I'm told, namely Brian O'Donnell, the man with glasses on the back row, who gave us these papers through Paddy Cummins. Frank Lewis is the third man along, leaning slightly forward on the back row. John Carroll, the very young John Carroll, who became General President of the Union, is next to Frank. And then we've got one other person I wanted to pick out, I think. Or maybe not. Okay, the rest of the people are just local people. I say just local people, they were courageous people for representing their workers. In Nenagh, thanks again to Ger, there is this little monument or plaque to the Shamrock Working Men's Club, which is where a lot of revolutionary activity for labour and socialism took place in Nenagh. So again, you can see that was erected by the Nenagh branch in 2012. So you can see Ger's influence is not just the book, but he's putting his stamp in the concrete of Nenagh all over the place. And this is Ger's book, Loosening the Chains. A terrific read. If you're not even interested in trade unionism, but you're interested not just in Nenagh, but that whole part of the county, including Burr and Offaly, then Ger's book is well worth reading. A lovely, lovely man, Ger, and I would see him quite regularly because he would come up to Dublin even after retirement. Nothing to do with trade unionism. It would be a pint, a song, and then he'd go to the rugby match. He was a fanatic of rugby match. So that just concludes us, and I hope you've found something of use to you. And I think the data that I've said is now online. For those people involved here in local history, you've got a great eye into working class activity across the county, at least for that earlier period. They stopped publishing that detail after 1930 when the union had basically collapsed. So thank you very much for your attention.